Hello friends and welcome back to my channel. Today we are doing my March monthly reading wrap up. Now, if I counted correctly, I finished 35 books in March, which I'm pretty chuffed about. Now, I'm not going to talk about every single book I read in the month of March because that would just take a long time, but I'm going to try and talk about as many as possible. And we're going to start with the lowest rated books and we're going to work all our way up to the wonderful 5-star books that I read in March. Lucky for me, I didn't have any 1-star books, but I did have a couple of 2-star books. So let's start with talking about those. Let's rip the band-aid off and talk about Piranesi. This book, I know, is so highly acclaimed, so well beloved. It's got like a 4.4-star rating on Goodreads, which is exceptional. And I honestly thought I was going to love this book. I was reading it with a couple of friends in a sort of mini book club, and I was so excited about this book. But I have to be honest, I did not like it. I've said it before, but I'm going to say it again. This is the longest short book I have ever read. And it is very hard to talk about without spoiling, but it's basically about this character named Piranesi, who lives in a very strange place, and he's mostly alone except for his weekly meetings with one other person who he has named the Other. And this book is essentially Piranesi's diaries, and from his perspective we learn more about this world, more about the Other, more about him and his past. It's an unfolding mystery with Piranesi at the center. And I've heard people describe this book as a work of art, genius, the best book they've ever read. And here I am on the internet giving it 2 stars. For me, this was boring. It took me so long to read because I just did not want to pick it up. I found this utterly predictable, and I don't just mean that in the sense that we as the reader often sort of figure stuff out before Piranesi does. That element of the book is very intentional, but in terms of like the actual, like what the mystery is, what the house is, who the Other is, I had a pretty good idea of those in general terms from very early on. And so this haunting sense of what's happening and the mystery unfolding, I didn't find any of that interesting because nothing surprised me. On top of that, although Piranesi's naivety is almost charming, it wasn't enough for me to like fall in love with him as a character. So I wasn't invested in the plot, I wasn't invested in the mystery, and I didn't really at least care enough about the characters. I can appreciate that some of the themes that are explored in this, I'm sure that some people found those very interesting. For example, the sort of blurred lines between science and magic, an exploration of what memories are and, you know, what makes us who we are, how different people derive meaning. But for me, none of it was nuanced enough or interesting enough for me to care, and I kept waiting for something interesting to happen. And I hear people all the time say that the first half of this is a bit slow, but then it really gets going. For me, I just was waiting right up until the very end, and I would have DNF'd this many times over were I not reading this for the book club. I knew my friends had finished it, and so I felt like obligated to push through. And of course, I'm sure we'll have plenty of interesting discussion when we get together and talk about it. But as far as our reading experience goes, this was just absolutely not it for me. And then another book that I thought I would love, but was an utter disappointment, is Wotakoi, Love is Hard for an Otaku by Fujita. This was boring. This actually featured in a reading vlog I did, reading a bunch of first volumes of manga series, and this is quite clearly not a series I will be continuing with, despite going into this thinking it could be a new favorite. The concept behind this is that our 2 main characters were friends in middle school, I think, and then they sort of meet up again later in the workforce in their mid-20s. They're both otakus, like big nerds. She's trying to hide it, he doesn't care about hiding it too much, and it has gotten in the way of her dating life in the past. So they decide, why not just date each other? They can play video games and fall in love. How cute. Except this is supposed to be a romance, and that's literally where the romance starts and ends. The rest of the book is more just little skits of them hanging out with a couple of other friends who are also super nerdy. There was a few too many jokes about him loving big boobs and her being flat-chested, and that's sort of as deep and meaningful as this ever got. This was not a romance in my opinion. This was a sitcom in a manga. With a fun setup to be sure, but in my opinion it didn't build on that setup at all. And of course this is only the first 2 volumes of I think 11, but there's no way that I'm continuing on past this point. I just don't think this is for me. The first 3-star book I'll talk about is Spy Family by Tatsuya Endo. This is another one that was featured in one of my manga reading vlogs, And I did really like this. I thought it was a whole lot of fun. It's basically the story of Twilight, who is the greatest spy of all time, and he has been given the mission to infiltrate an elite private school. But to do that, he sort of has to find himself a daughter and a wife. So he goes to an orphanage and adopts a little girl. And he manages to convince a woman to sort of fake marry him. But it turns out that the little girl is secretly a telepath, and the woman is secretly an assassin. So a spy, a telepath, and an assassin trying to infiltrate a school. What could go wrong? It's just really funny, a little bit absurd. I love the setup. I think it's great. And I did really enjoy this volume. I just didn't feel invested enough to continue the series, at least at this point. I think this is something that I would prefer to watch the anime of when it comes out. I think one is due quite soon. Next up, we've got A Perfect World, which is volume 1 of another manga series that I read in one of my manga reading vlogs. This is a story of two people who were friends in high school. In fact, she had a crush on him in high school, who haven't seen each other for a long time, but then meet up in their mid-20s at work. Except he is now disabled, having been in quite a severe car accident. So it's about these two people getting to know each other again, learning about each other and their new circumstances. It's very thoughtful and intentionally done. It's not always perfect as far as the disability representation is concerned, but it comes pretty close. And especially with visible disability, I don't think there's a great deal of representation, especially in manga. So I do appreciate it for that. Then I did also read volumes 3 and 4 of Maison Ikkoku. This is a series that I did start reading in a vlog with you. And I was really quite conflicted about my feelings even back then when I was reading volume 1. But I liked Kyoko, our female main character, so much that I decided to continue with it. And I managed to get up to volume 5. So I've been reading through these. And I was actually starting to really enjoy it right up until the very last chapter of volume 3, which was just utter crap. I don't know how else to say it. I have heard incredible things about the sort of late stage of this manga and how it develops and how their relationship develops, and how especially Godai as a person really matures. And I've really been looking forward to that. But honestly, it's happening too slowly for my liking. And especially in that last chapter of volume 3, it was just... It crossed so many lines that are just not okay and made me feel so uncomfortable about reading this at all. This was written back in the 80s, so I've been trying to view it with a bit more of a generous lens than perhaps I might normally read something. It is pushing me. It is pushing me to my limits. I still really love Kyoko, and I don't know, I'm so invested in her that I do want to keep going, but every now and then there's just a chapter that is just gross and it makes me mad. If you have read this series, I would love to hear what you think. I mean, I've already got 5 volumes. I think there's 10 in total. They're not all released in this. They've been reprinted basically in English after being out of print for quite a while. Do I keep going, hoping for that character development and hoping for that incredible ending that I've heard all about? Or do I just tap out? Because I'm tired of the objectification, the sexism, and just the creepiness of a few too many of the men in this series. Let me know, because I'm very conflicted. And I'm putting this in the 3-star category because overall this series has been about a 3-star for me so far. But if you were to ask me specifically about volume 3, it would be much, much further down on the list. Then I also read Mina and the Whole Wide World by Sherryl Clarke. This is the proof that I picked up from work. And this is actually a novel written in verse with cute little illustrations throughout. This is the story of a young girl called Mina who is very excited to finally be getting her own room. That is up until the last moment when her family ends up housing and taking care of for a few weeks a young boy. His name is Azumi, and he gets to sleep in what would be Mina's new room, and she's not too happy about this. Azumi also has to go to school with Mina, and the other kids sort of pick on him because he's a bit different, he's a bit quiet. And as the story goes on, we learn that Azumi and his mother were refugees to Australia, and his mother is currently ill. She's in hospital, and so Azumi just needs a place to stay for a little while. And it's basically the story of Mina learning that sometimes in order to do the right thing, we have to give up things that we want. Although I do think that this has a really important message about the plight of refugees, the difficulties they face both getting to Australia and then once they are in Australia, it did feel very much like a story for Australian children about refugee children. It was very much about their character development, their understanding of Azumi's situation, especially Mina. For example, towards the end, their teacher thinks that if Azumi can tell his story, of being a refugee and sort of where he's come from to the class, then the other kids might better understand him and stop picking on him. And I just felt like that was such a shitty position to put this child in. Like, literally, can you stand up in front of the class and relive your trauma so that other kids will have a character development moment? Is that really how we're doing things? I don't know. I didn't love it. I did like how Azumi decided to sort of do that in his own way. He loves to draw, so he decides to tell his story through his drawings to the class. And there is a really beautiful moment where a lot of the kids start to understand that, you don't always know what other people have been through. And so we have to sort of start from a place of compassion rather than of judgment. So there's a lot to like about this. I did really like the writing style. It was very easy and quick to read, but I think it's just such a tricky and complex subject to tackle. And I don't know that I loved all of the ways that the author chose to do it in. Now onto my 4-star reads, which is definitely the biggest category for this video. And before I forget, I will start with the 4-star audiobook that I read this month. That was In the Shadow of a Mountain by Silvia Vasquez-Lavado. And I received this audiobook through Libro FM's ALC program, so thank you to them. This was an incredible and very, very moving memoir. I did find elements of it quite difficult. Definitely a lot of content warnings for everything from sexual violence, including of a minor, to discussions of trafficking, other kinds of violence, as well as mental illness and suicide. It's a lot, it's heavy, but it's Silvia's life, and she details it with such clarity and open-heartedness that it was really difficult not to get lost in her beautiful words and in a really powerful message of perseverance. So we learn about her and her whole life journey, as well as her very difficult journey to climb Mount Everest. She starts the climb of Mount Everest by taking a group of women and non-binary folk up to base camp. These are all people that she's met who have experienced some pretty extreme forms of violence, especially as they were growing up and from the men in their lives. Some of these women were even trafficked, and we learn bits about their stories. And they climb up to base camp of Mount Everest together in a really moving, incredible display of personal strength. And then from base camp, Silvia joins another group who are attempting to climb the rest of Mount Everest. Silvia's life and what has led her to climb Mount Everest is a very difficult journey in and of itself. She experienced sexual violence from a friend of her family for many, many years. And then she moved to America to go to university, and she had plenty of her own troubles there, including substance abuse, and then a lot of internalized homophobia as she started to explore the fact that she was gay. Then her own personal tumultuous relationships, including with one woman who she very much loved who had bipolar disorder and does die by suicide. And these may be considered spoilers, but I feel like it's really important to give you some of these specifics because I did not know going in, and things like bipolar and suicide and alcohol abuse and like very explicit detail about all of those things are some massive big triggers for me personally. And so I did find this book very, very hard to get through. But Silvia was just such a strong presence, and she had such a level of clarity and hope and optimism and strength to her as from the perspective that she's standing at now telling us this story that I just sort of felt pulled along with her. Anyway, it's an incredible book. Definitely one I recommend if you love a hard-hitting memoir about an absolutely incredible woman. Next, let's talk about some of the books that I started reading for the middle grade March readathon. I didn't get as into middle grade March readathon as I was hoping to, but I read a number of books and a lot of them have ended up in the 4-star category, so let's talk about them together. First is Allergic, which is a very cute little story about a girl who wants nothing more than to have a puppy. And then when she finally goes to get a puppy, it becomes very evident that she is severely allergic to all animals. And so she cannot have a puppy. It's also a story about friendship. It's very cute and I identified with quite a lot of it. Then I read Inside Out and Back Again, which is a novel in verse based on the author's own lived experience of being a refugee, fleeing the Vietnam War with her family and moving to America. Quite a lot of this details life in Vietnam for her family and what it was like, and then also literally the journey out of Vietnam to America, And then the second half is sort of her trying to settle in with her family to a school environment, to learning English, to overcoming the culture shock and just the challenges that come along with being an outsider. It's really well done and a very emotional read, and I really enjoyed the verse format as well. And then When Rain Turns to Snow by Jane Godwin. This is actually a book that my favorite customer recommended me at work, and it wasn't at all what I was expecting. I mean, this cover and the blurb definitely give strong middle grade vibes, but the content, I would argue, is more young adult than it is middle grade. I would say that this book is ideal for 12 to 15-year-olds. Having said that, it does deal with some pretty mature topics, and so this is for readers who love hard-hitting, more emotional stories. In this story, we follow a 14-year-old girl named Lissa who is sort of at home alone one afternoon after school when a boy her age shows up on her doorstep holding a baby. His name is Reed, and he's run away from home after discovering that he was adopted, and he's asking for Lissa's mother by name because he believes that she might be his mother too. It's quite a moving story about family, about identity, about adoption, and I really enjoyed those aspects of the story. There are other issues that are also brought in throughout, including things like nudes of minors that are being posted online, even a brief fleeting suggestion of mental health awareness and suicide issues as well. Of course, then there's also the issue of the baby and these 14-year-olds sort of like secretly trying to take care of and doing a terrible job of taking care of an infant. I personally found this very readable. I really enjoyed the characters of Lissa and Reed and their relationship, and just how they came to support and understand each other and learn so much more about their families in the process. I didn't like the aspect of the baby. I felt like that was unnecessary. It just added so much drama, and I just kind of felt sick the whole time with how poorly these two kids were taking care of the baby. And then as far as the other issues, some of those were handled better than others. For example, like I think the mental health aspect was not dealt with nearly as much attention or intention as it deserved. And as for the nudes, I didn't like the resolution to that because I just didn't feel like there were enough consequences. So yeah, it's just a bit of a tricky one, and personally I did really enjoy it. I found it very compelling, very interesting, loved the characters. But as a bookseller, I don't know about the marketing of this book. I find that quite confusing and not in line with the content. Then for some more manga, I read volume 1 of Sweat and Soap. Please don't look at me like that. I know what this looks like. I just heard really good things about it. It's basically about a woman who profusely sweats. She just has always had this issue. And she works at a company that produces and manufactures different soaps and perfumes. And she's a big fan of this company, so she loves working there. And one day she captures the attention of the man who's sort of in charge of coming up with new products, like developing new products. And he is kind of obsessed with the way that she smells. Yes, I can hear myself as I'm saying this out loud. Basically, they just end up forming a really close romantic and physical relationship. It's not as like weird and fetishy as that makes it sound. That's more the setup. They do develop quite a sweet romance along the way. How do I talk about this on the internet? I don't know, for me this wasn't quite enough romance to be like super cute romance, but it also wasn't enough sex to be super hot. It sort of towed the line, which I'm sure is what some people like, but I kind of wanted more of one and less of the other, and I wouldn't mind which. I don't know. It was fun. It was a bit weird. I'm not mad at it. I did enjoy it, but yeah. Okay, moving on. Blue Flag, I've still only read volume 1. I'm waiting for more volumes to come in. I spoke about this in a vlog. This is a high school love triangle, but it turns into a quadrangle. Kind of complicated, but I really enjoy the characters, and I'm really enjoying the sort of complex emotional setup. And a bit of LGBTQ representation as well. I've read volume 2 of Boys Run the Riot. Boys Run the Riot volume 1 was by far my favorite volume of manga that I've read, I think this year. I loved it. I still really enjoyed volume 2. It didn't have quite as much impact for me as volume 1 did. In this volume, we're just following along as Ro and Jin are sort of furthering their journey in creating this fashion brand, and Ro ends up getting a part-time job to sort of help fund it, and he meets a few interesting people at that job. So a pretty good second installment, not as strong as the first, but I still just love Ro, love Jin, and am fully invested in this story. There's only 4 volumes, and I will be getting and reading them all. Then I did read volume 1 with you of Doughnuts Under a Crescent Moon. I have since read volume 2. This is a really sweet Yuri series of 2 adult women in their 20s, very, very, very slowly falling in love. And it's just wholesome, adorable. I love it. I think without being too explicit, it does explore the concept of compet quite well, especially for Uno, who just doesn't even contemplate the idea that she might be queer. She just really feels like she needs to fit herself into the box of falling in love with a man, marrying a man, fulfilling the role of being a wife, and she feels like there's something wrong with her because she can't. We learn a bit more about Asahi as well, and her family and her sort of like background, and why she's a bit emotionally closed off in volume 2. So I really like this series. I like both of them a lot, and I can't wait for more to come out and be available. Then, as I mentioned in the reading vlog where I read the first volume of After the Rain, I did manage to get the entire series secondhand for a very good price. So I did read the other 4 volumes this month. And this series, I'm putting here all together, even though not all of the volumes were like 4-star. Overall, the series has kind of come out for me as a 4-star series. I can't remember if it was volume 2 or volume 3, but one of them I did not like, and I gave 2 stars, primarily because of the representation, like the visual, like images. There was a couple that just like overly sexualized Akira, and it just felt entirely unnecessary. It wasn't part of the plot. It wasn't part of what was happening. It was like she was unwell and she had a fever, and they made it look sexy for some reason. Like that was just off-putting to me. And for a moment I did regret bothering to pick up the rest of the series. But after that toned down, like that did stop. It just felt so unnecessary. I don't know why they put that in there. The rest of the series really worked for me. As I explained in my manga reading vlog, this is basically the story of 17-year-old Akira, who was a big track star. She loved running, but she ends up with quite a severe injury that gets her off the track. And she ends up sort of falling in love, lust, infatuation with her 45-year-old manager, who, like, she works at a restaurant and he manages a restaurant. And I guess spoilers for the ending, if you don't want to know anything about this, then I'll put up a little thing here. They do not end up together. To me, that was very clear from the outset that this was not meant to be a romance. I don't like that people call it a romance. Instead, this is a drama. It's a story about 2 people who are kind of lost in their own lives. And Akira in particular, although she may look like a grown woman, she is very immature in a lot of ways. In particular, the fact that she almost clings to and becomes obsessed with Kondo because she doesn't have track anymore. It's like she latches onto him to fill some kind of void, which is a very immature thing to do and speaks a lot to her level of development at 17. And although I didn't like all of Kondo's choices, I think he could have been a lot more firm and clear with Akira about his boundaries and the fact that, you know, he's 45 and any relationship between them is entirely inappropriate. I think he does feel for her without falling in love with her in kind of like a weird sexual way. He feels for her. I think he can see the fact that she is missing something of meaning in her life, and so she's trying to make meaning out of some idea of love. And through her infatuation of him, he starts to reflect on his own life and his own directions and his own goals. And so although it is not a romance, they do not end up together. There's no suggestion of them ending up together ever. Like, I felt like that was very clear from the beginning, and I was only worried that the author would try to subvert that by making some kind of happy ending. Instead, this is a story of 2 people who, through their challenges, end up helping set each other on the right path again. To me, this story was really compelling. I mean, I read all of this in a matter of a few days. I couldn't put it down. I really loved Akira. I felt so much for her, just in her her youthfulness, her naivety, her vulnerability, and I thought the ending was really beautiful. So I was really happy that although I knew this was controversial going into it, the age gap thing, I had a feeling, and like to me the first volume, it was clear that that's not the direction it was going in. And so what I got instead was a really interesting exploration of two characters in like sort of both at different crossroads and like witnessing each other at those crossroads. I thought it was quite beautiful. And now for my 5-star reads. Again, I'll start with the audiobooks that I read this month that ended up getting 5 stars from me. And again, both of these came from Libro FM's ALC program. The first, which I started late last month and finished early this month, was Recitative by Toni Morrison, with the foreword by Zadie Smith. I actually ended up listening to this entire thing twice. I loved it that much. Recitative is a story that we've had published for a long time by Toni Morrison. I've never read it, and this sort of new reissue with the introduction by, or the foreword by Zadie Smith is incredible. The story is basically a tale of two girls who we meet in childhood. We know that one is black and that one is white, but we don't know which is which. And we follow them as they grow up. It's a very short story, but it was just hugely compelling. And I think it was made all the more impactful, at least for me, by the incredible foreword by Zadie Smith. Like, I think the story itself might have been like a 4-star read, but the combination of the two in this packaging, in this book, was incredible. And so, like I said, literally as soon as I finished it, I didn't even wait a day. I just hit play again and started listening right from the beginning with Zadie's introduction all the way through for a second time. I do think that I had a little bit of a different experience than maybe other readers will have, just simply by the virtue of being Australian. Zadie spoke a lot in her introduction about how readers often sort of try to figure out which character is white, which character is black. And I think part of me was doing that subconsciously, but I think a lot of the sort of signs or representations of race that Toni Morrison was hinting at throughout the story, I think a lot of them honestly were lost on me simply because they're so culturally specific to America. So I personally wasn't so tied into figuring out which girl was black and which girl was white. I was just more interested in the not knowing and the intangibility of that. Like, I think it was so cleverly done by Toni Morrison in that there was no way for me to know. Like, I knew that going in, so I wasn't trying to figure it out. I was not trying to outsmart Toni Morrison. Like, that was not going to happen, so I wasn't even going to try. But I just found like the juxtaposition of their two experiences and knowing that race was a big part of their experiences, but not knowing which was which. I just thought that that was an incredible experience to have. And I loved especially how memory played such a big part in this story and how these two characters remembered experiences that they shared so differently. I thought that was potent. Anyway, this was incredible. Kind of like Open Waters last month that I read. Like, I would like to purchase a copy of this book because I enjoyed it so much. I mean, I don't know that I will because I only have so much shelf space and there's so many other books that I want to get to and want to buy. But this was one of those books that I thought it was almost perfection. Like, the whole experience of Zadie's foreword and then Toni Morrison's experiment of a short story was just incredible. Then I also listened to Nina LaCour's new book, Yerba Buena. I actually tried to read We Are Okay or You Are Okay by Nina LaCour a couple of months ago. I got it out from the library and I don't know whether it was me or the timing, but I just couldn't get into that book. So I DNF'd it quite quickly. And I didn't even realize that it was the same author until the end. After I'd finished, and I sort of went to check it on Goodreads. Anyway, this was an incredibly beautiful story, utterly moving. It follows a few different characters, but we start in a small town in America with two 14-year-old girls who are falling in love in secret. It's absolutely gorgeous. But then as they get a little bit older, one of them gets involved with drugs and ends up dying. And so the other girl sort of just runs away, just flees, leaves the town, doesn't return. And it's about her story as well as another character's story. And it's gorgeous. I don't want to say too much more than that. I feel like there's so much that unfolds throughout the years that this book covers. And it was just one of the most beautiful, tender books. And so beautifully written as well. Like, obviously I was listening to it, but it just felt so evocative and sensual and raw. I just loved it. Nearly every time I was listening to this book, whether I was going for a walk or I was on the bus, I was crying, whether because it was heartbreaking or it was just so beautiful. I loved it. I loved this book. Then, as I mentioned, I've read plenty of picture books this month as well, but I didn't really want to talk about the ones that I just were mediocre or good. There were just a couple that I absolutely adored that I wanted to mention here. The first is A Pair of Pears and an Orange by Anna McGregor. This is just a really funny, playful, silly sort of a book, but I love the artwork. It's just very colorful, vibrant, quite simple. And it's just a really sweet story about friendships and about including people. And it also has a bunch of puns and dad jokes. Can't go wrong. Then A Tale of a Tiny Man. I think from what I understand, this is like a Swedish classic that's been translated into English. And it's a bit of a longer, more wordy picture book, but it is still a picture book. And it's just a really sweet story about a little old man who is quite lonely and he just really wants a friend. And so he ends up making friends with a dog. Oh, I loved this. It was so sweet. And then the book that has made me cry more than any other book this month, and yes, it is a picture book, it is Ida Always. This is the most beautiful story of mortality, death, and grief that I've seen in a picture book. It was just gorgeous. It's about these two polar bears who live in the zoo in New York City, and they're just really good friends. Every day they come out and they spend the day together, and they're just really happy until one day they find out that Ida is sick and she's not going to get better. It's so beautiful. I read it at work. Well, first my colleague read it at work and she started crying. And so then a customer read it because she saw her crying. She started crying. So then I read it and I was a mess. I was sobbing. It's just really beautiful. Obviously a very specific, sensitive topic for children, but a topic that a lot of children have to learn about. And this was just such a beautiful book. The illustrations are gorgeous. It was just amazing. And then my favorite manga of the month was by far Guardians of the Louvre by Jiro Taniguchi. Jiro Taniguchi is an author that I've read a couple of manga from before. One of, I think my favorite manga ever is Furari by Jiro Taniguchi. It's set in the Edo period and it's just about a guy walking, and it's the most beautiful thing I've ever read. I have read another one of his ones that I didn't like as much, but I knew I needed to pick this up when I saw it. This is part of a series, I think, that the Louvre actually sort of commissioned a bunch of different artists. This is Jiro Taniguchi's entry, and it is huge, but I really liked it. This is a story of a man who's visiting the Louvre, but towards the end of his trip, before he actually gets a chance to go to the Louvre, he ends up quite sick and with a really bad fever. But then he does manage to get to the Louvre and he's sort of looking around. But then he meets one of the statues, sort of comes to him in spirit form. She's the guardian of the Louvre. And he is then sort of transported into the past. And he learns about the history of the Louvre as well as the history of the area, some of the artists. And you're never quite sure if it's his fever dream or if it's some mystical experience. But I love that. I love that ambiguity. It's really simple, but just really beautiful. I loved it so much. And the fact that we were lucky enough to get full color. This entire book is full color. Like often I get excited when there's a few pages of color in Jiro Taniguchi's art books, but this one, the whole thing is color and it's divine. It's so beautiful. I just find his work like soothing. It just sort of takes me out of time and place where I can just have a moment where I'm in this artwork, where I'm walking the streets, where I'm just quiet. It's almost meditative reading his work, I think. It was just wonderful. Okay, so those are most of the books that I managed to read in March. Thank you so much for sticking with me if you've made it all the way to the end. I would love to hear what you read in March, especially if there's any standouts that you would recommend, and I will talk to you in the next video. Until then, so much love. Bye.